She stood alone in a courtroom with no lawyer, no money, and no allies. Just a stack of papers tied with kitchen string and a pencil stub in her pocket. Across from her sat two men who wanted to destroy her. One had followed her 1,000 miles to drag her back to the life she fled. The other had killed a man and buried the truth. Behind her sat three brothers who would lose everything if she failed. And in the gallery, a 7-year-old girl clutched a wooden horse and waited to find out if she still had a home. This is the story of how one woman with nothing fought two powerful men with everything and won. Now let us go back to the beginning. The girl who came to Montana carried one bag, 3 letters, and a secret that could kill her. No one met her at the station, and within a week she would stand in a courtroom alone, facing 2 men who wanted to destroy her and 3 men willing to die to protect her. But that is getting ahead of things. The train lurched to a stop at the Copper Creek platform on a Tuesday afternoon in August of 1878, and Eliza Weston stepped down onto warped wooden planks with legs that had forgotten how to hold still. 16 days on a train will do that to a person. 16 days of watching America change outside a window. The tight brick buildings of Philadelphia giving way to farmland, then prairie, then mountains rising like old gods from the earth. 16 days of sleeping upright in a third-class seat. 16 days of rationing the small amount of money she had taken from her mother's household accounts, knowing it was theft, knowing she would do it again. She stood on the platform with a carpet bag in one hand and the other hand pressed flat against her stomach, where the nerves had gathered into a fist. The August heat came down like a hammer on an anvil. Everything smelled of dust and horse sweat, and the sharp bite of sage carried on a wind that never stopped moving. The crowd thinned around her. Miners with blackened faces walked toward the saloons. Cowboys in leather and dust moved toward the livery. A family with 3 small children chased each other between trunks and bags, laughing in a way that made Eliza's chest tighten. Everyone had somewhere to go. Everyone belonged to something. Eliza did not. She stood alone on the platform and waited. 5 minutes, 10, 15. The station master, a thin man with a tobacco-stained mustache, looked at her twice and then a third time with the particular expression men reserve for women standing alone in places they should not be. She had 3 letters in the pocket of her traveling dress. She had read them so many times the paper had gone soft at the creases and the ink had begun to blur where her fingers held tightest. 3 letters from 3 men she had never met, 3 brothers who had placed an advertisement in the Philadelphia Inquirer between notices for tonics and land sales. 3 brothers ranchers in Montana Territory seek a wife, must be strong and practical, willing to work, no Eastern frills or delicate sensibilities. Write to Callaway Brothers, Copper Creek, Montana Territory. She had written that same night, hands shaking, ink blotting. She told the truth about her situation because lies only delay the discovery. 24 years old, unmarried, father dead, mother remarried, desperate to leave, educated beyond what was proper for a woman, but unable to apologize for it. She sealed the letter before courage failed her and posted it the next morning. The reply came 3 weeks later. The first letter was from Silas Callaway. Strong, clear script. No warmth and no pretense. He laid out the arrangement without decoration. 3 brothers running a ranch too large for hired help alone. Isolated. Demanding. No place for a woman who expected society and refinement. They needed a partner, not an ornament. Someone to manage the household help. With the books, understand that frontier life meant hardship as often as beauty. The second letter came from Levi Callaway. Different handwriting. More flowing. More careful. He wrote about books, about the library their mother had collected before she died, about long winter nights reading by the fire, about missing conversation and connection, and the sound of a woman's voice in a house that had gone too quiet. We are not brutes, he wrote. We are simply men who need a woman brave enough to build with us. The third letter was from Colton Callaway, and it was the shortest of all. My brothers will talk about partnership and respect. All true. But you should know this. Montana breaks weak people. If you are coming, come knowing that. If you cannot ride and cannot work and cannot survive what this land throws at you, stay in Philadelphia. Eliza had read that third letter more times than the other 2 combined. Not because it was kind, because it was honest. And Eliza Weston had spent the last 6 months drowning in lies and needed honesty the way a choking person needs air. Now she stood on a train platform in a territory she had never seen, holding a bag that contained everything she owned, and the men who had written those letters were nowhere in sight. She picked up her bag, set her jaw, walked toward the only building that looked like it sold things people needed. Hensley Dry Goods, faded letters above the door, a bell that chimed when she pushed through into the smell of coffee and kerosene and dried apples. Behind the counter stood a woman with gray curled hair, pulled back, a face that had stopped trying to be pretty 30 years ago and settled instead for honest, and eyes that missed nothing and forgave less. The woman looked at Eliza from boots to bonnet, took in the dust on her traveling dress, the dark circles beneath her eyes, the single bag, the way she held herself straight despite obvious exhaustion. "You are the mail-order bride for the Calloway boys," the woman said. It was not a question. Eliza set her bag down. "I am." The woman began pulling items from shelves without being asked. A tin of crackers, a jar of water. She set them on the counter and pushed them toward Eliza with the matter-of-fact kindness of a person who feeds strays because someone has to. "I am Opal Hensley," she said. "I own this store. The Calloway Ranch is 2 hours north by wagon. They are probably held up with cattle. That happens." Then Opal paused, her hands stilled on the counter. She looked at Eliza with something that was not quite pity and not quite warning, but lived somewhere between the two. "You should know," she said. "You are not the first woman to answer that advertisement. 2 others came before you." Eliza's hand stopped halfway to the crackers. "Where are they now?" Opal held her gaze for a long time. "They left. Both of them. In the middle of the night. Neither one told me why. The words settled between them like dust after a wagon passes." Eliza did not know what to do with them. She filed them away in the place inside her chest where she kept the things she could not yet afford to feel. She was reaching for the water when the front door opened and brought in cold air and sunlight and a voice that cut through the quiet of the store like a blade through silk. "Well now, so this is the new Calloway bride." Eliza turned. The woman who stood in the doorway was 50 years old, slim as a fence rail, dressed in a blue wool dress with a cameo brooch at her throat. She carried herself with the absolute certainty of a person who had decided long ago that her opinion and the Lord's were interchangeable. 2 women flanked her like attendants at a court, their faces arranged in matching expressions of pleasant disapproval. Vivian Pruitt swept into the store and stopped 3 paces from Eliza. Her eyes traveled a slow circuit. Dusty boots, calloused hands, sunburned face, frayed collar, single bag. She smiled the way a cat smiles at a bird it has cornered. "Another Eastern girl come to try her luck," Vivian said, turning to her companions with practiced sorrow. "The last one was a school teacher, lasted 3 days. The one before that was a widow, also vanished." She turned back to Eliza and let her smile sharpen. "Looking at you, dear, I give it a week." The 2 women behind her exchanged glances and laughed softly. The sound was small and cruel and designed to make Eliza feel exactly as small as they wanted her to feel. Something shifted inside Eliza's chest. Not anger, not yet, but the memory of anger. The memory of every room she had entered in Philadelphia after her father died, every parlor where women looked at her the way Vivian Pruitt was looking at her now, measuring her worth by what she lacked instead of what she carried. She straightened her back, lifted her chin, met Vivian Pruitt's eyes without flinching. "Mrs. Pruitt," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she expected. "I do not know what happened to the 2 women before me, but I traveled 1,000 miles to get here, and I did not travel 1,000 miles to turn around." The store went silent. Opal Hensley stood behind the counter with her hands flat on the wood and something in her eyes that might have been approval. The 2 church women stopped laughing. Vivian Pruitt's smile did not waver, but something behind it recalculated, the way a predator recalculates when prey turns out to have teeth. "My husband is the judge of this county," dear Vivian said. Her voice was sweet and her meaning was not. "Respect is earned through proper conduct, and proper conduct does not include living with 3 unmarried men without a marriage certificate." She held Eliza's gaze for one more moment, a moment that said, "I know what you are, and I know what happens to women like you in this town." Then she turned with a swish of blue wool and swept through the back curtain, her attendants following like obedient shadows. Eliza stood alone in the store. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against the counter until they stopped. Opal Hensley leaned close. Her voice was low and fast. "That woman is a loaded gun," she said, "and she does not miss. Be careful." Before Eliza could respond, the front door opened again, and this time the light that came through it was blocked entirely. 3 men filled the doorway. 3 men who made the store and everything in it feel suddenly impossibly small. Eliza's first thought was that she was seeing triple. They were that alike. Same height, all 3 of them, towering well over 6 feet, and forcing the doorframe to accommodate shoulders that seemed designed for a larger world than this one. Same chestnut hair catching the afternoon light in shades of copper and gold. Same amber eyes, pale and sharp, the eyes of men who spent their lives reading weather and cattle and the intentions of strangers across open ground. Same sun-darkened skin, same jaw, same build. They were not identical, but they were close enough to make a stranger look twice and then a third time. The differences lived in the details. The eldest had a scar running along his left jaw from ear to chin, pale against weathered skin, the mark of barbed wire that had gotten too close. The middle one stood slightly tilted to the left, the posture of a man who leaned against bookshelves more often than fence posts. The youngest had hands calloused thicker than his brother's, the hands of a man who did the heaviest work and never wore gloves. The one with the scar stepped forward. His boots were heavy on the plank floor. His eyes swept the store landing on Vivian Pruitt's retreating form through the back curtain with an expression that dropped the temperature in the room by several degrees. Then his eyes found Eliza. He looked at her single bag, at her straight back, at her eyes which were red from 16 days of travel but were not looking away. "Miss Weston," he said. His voice was low and rough, the kind of voice that comes from years of talking to horses and cattle and wind instead of people. "I am Silas Calloway. Sorry we are late. Had a cow fall into a gully. Took half the day getting her out." The explanation was brief, not defensive. The voice of a man who stated facts and did not consider whether they needed decoration. He reached for her bag, took it from her hand. It was heavy to her. It was nothing in his. The second brother stepped forward. His eyes were the same amber, but warmer. "Miss Weston," he said, "your journey must have been exhausting. There is water in the wagon." "I am Levi." The third brother stayed in the doorway, arms crossed over a chest that seemed to have been assembled from oak and iron and stubbornness. He looked at Eliza from head to boots, the way a man looks at a horse he is not sure about. Measuring, assessing, reserving judgment. "You are smaller than I figured," he said. Levi turned. "Colton." Colton shrugged one massive shoulder. "Just saying." Eliza looked at him, at all 3 of them. These men she had traveled 1,000 miles to meet. These men who were supposed to be her future. They were larger than she had imagined, rougher, more real. Standing this close to them, she could smell leather and sage and the honest sweat of men who had been working since before dawn. She was terrified. She would not show it. "Shall we go?" she said. Silas gave a single nod, picked up her bag and walked toward the door. Levi gestured for her to follow. Colton stood aside just enough to let her pass, his amber eyes tracking her, like a man who has learned that the things most dangerous to a ranch often come in small packages. The wagon waited at the edge of town. Silas helped her up to the seat, one hand on her elbow, firm and brief. She felt the strength in that grip, the kind of strength that could snap a fence post or cradle a newborn calf with equal ease. She sat on the bench between Silas and Levi. Colton took the reins. They rode out of Copper Creek and into land that seemed to have no end. The road narrowed. Prairie gave way to rolling hills dotted with cattle. Fence lines stretched into the distance. Mountains rose ahead, purple and gray, against the sky so wide it made Eliza's chest ache with something she could not name. Freedom, maybe? Or fear? Or both? "Tell us about yourself," Silas said. Not a request, not quite a command, something between. Eliza chose her words carefully. "My father was a professor. He loved books and he loved gambling. He died 6 months ago of apoplexy and left behind $15,000 in debts. My mother remarried within 2 months to a man named Edgar Harwell, a lawyer, wealthy enough to pay the debts, respectable enough to restore our social standing. He became my legal guardian until I turned 25. She paused, watched the landscape moving past. I needed a new life, she said. I found your advertisement. I wrote. You wrote back. Here I am. She did not tell them the rest. Did not tell them about Edgar's hands finding reasons to touch her when no one was watching. Did not tell them about the bedroom door tried 3 times in the dark. Did not tell them about the night he came drunk and she screamed and her mother heard and did nothing. Not yet. That truth would come when it was ready. Pulling at it too early only tears the fabric. What can you do? Colton asked from the driver's seat without turning around. I can keep books. I can manage a household. I can ride. You can ride. The skepticism in his voice was thick enough to cut. My father kept horses before he lost everything. Colton said nothing, but Eliza saw his shoulders shift, filing the information, reserving further judgment until he had evidence. Levi spoke, his voice softer than his brother's. Your letters mentioned Wuthering Heights. Eliza looked at him. I love that book. I read it until the pages fell out. Something changed in Levi's face. A softening, a recognition. Our mother's favorite, he said. She read it to us a dozen times before she died. I think you would have liked her. The words hung in the air between them, warm despite the cooling afternoon. Eliza felt something shift inside her chest. These men were not what she had expected. They were harder and rougher and more real, but there was something beneath the surface. Something that had been shut away for a long time and was now pressing against the door. The ranch appeared in the last light of afternoon, tucked against the shoulder of a long ridge where the land rose quiet and the wind lost its edge. It was larger than Eliza had imagined, a sprawling structure of timber and stone with a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides, a barn that could house 20 horses, corrals and working pens spreading in every direction, outbuildings clustered nearby, fence lines reaching toward the mountains. This was not a homestead. This was an empire carved from wilderness through sweat and determination and the kind of will that does not break because it cannot afford to. That is it, Silas said. Eliza stared. It is magnificent, she said, and meant it. It is ours, Silas said simply. And if you stay, it will be yours as well. The weight of that sentence settled over her like a blanket she had not asked for but needed desperately. A woman appeared on the porch as the wagon rolled to a stop. 60 years old or close to it, solid as a stone wall, wiping her hands on an apron that had seen more flour and blood and hard work than most men see in a lifetime. She looked at Eliza and her eyes were sharp but not unkind. So this is the bride from Philadelphia, she said. About time you boys found someone. This house has been too quiet for too long. Miss Weston, Silas said, climbing down. This is Ida Brennan. She comes twice a week to help with the house. She has been keeping us fed and the place from falling into chaos. Ida snorted. Flattery will not save you from the talking to I have been saving up. 2 hours late. Left this poor girl standing at the station wondering if you had forgotten her entirely. She turned to Eliza and the sharpness in her face softened into something that looked almost like tenderness. Come inside, dear. You must be dead on your feet. There is stew and bread. Let us get some food in you before you collapse. Eliza allowed herself to be ushered inside. The main room was large. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, comfortable furniture arranged around it. And there, along the opposite wall, reaching from floor to nearly the ceiling, were shelves of books, dozens of them, hundreds. Shakespeare and Milton, Plato and Aristotle, Darwin, Dickens, the Brontes. Eliza stopped walking. Her hand came up to her chest. Your mother's library, she said softly. Levi was behind her. His voice was quiet. She believed education was essential for everyone, men and women both. She made us study philosophy alongside ranching. Ida led her upstairs to a room that was simple but clean. A large bed covered in a handmade quilt, a dresser with a wash basin, a window overlooking the mountains, and above the dresser, a small shelf holding more books. Jane Eyre, a collection of Keats, a Bible with a cracked spine. This was Martha's room, Ida said. Martha Calloway, their mother. She died 17 years ago. Winter fever. The boys were just children. Silas was 16, Levi 15, Colton 14. Their father Ezra raised them alone after that, built this ranch into what it is. Ida paused, Her eyes moved to something beneath the bed, then moved away again quickly. Too quickly. She died in this room, Ida said. Ezra kept it exactly as it was. The boys never changed it. But Silas said you should have it, said their mother would have wanted a woman in this room again. Eliza set her bag on the bed. Thank you, Ida. The older woman lingered at the door. There was something in her face, something she wanted to say and was not yet ready to say. Then she nodded once and left. Eliza stood alone in a dead woman's room 1,000 miles from everything she had ever known. She should have felt afraid. Instead, she felt something she had not felt in 6 months. She felt the absence of fear. She had not locked the door. She had not checked whether it locked. She had not lain awake calculating the distance between her bed and the nearest exit. She had not listened for footsteps in the hallway. For the first time since Edgar Harwell entered her life, Eliza Weston breathed. She was kneeling to unpack her bag when her hand brushed something beneath the bed frame. She paused, reached further. Her fingers closed around the corner of a wooden box, small and heavy, pushed deep under the bed against the wall. She pulled it into the lamplight. It was made of dark oak, simple but well crafted. A brass lock held it shut. No key. Eliza ran her fingers over the lock. The box was old but well maintained. Someone had kept it oiled and clean. Someone had handled it regularly. She pushed it back beneath the bed. She said nothing about it. Not that night. Not yet. Supper was quiet. The four of them sat around a table large enough for 8, eating Ida's stew while the fire crackled and the wind pressed against the walls. Eliza studied each brother over her bowl. Silas ate with method. His eyes checked the windows, the door, the shadows beyond the lamplight. He ate the way a man eats who has learned that the world can change between one bite and the next, and wants to be ready when it does. Levi ate slowly. He watched Eliza with curiosity that was warm rather than invasive. When he learned she had read Wuthering Heights 3 times, he set down his spoon and said, "Our mother used to say that book was not about love. It was about what happens when people who belong together are kept apart by rules and fear." Sometimes, he added, his amber eyes holding hers, the only thing standing between people and happiness is the courage to reach for something unconventional. The words hung in the air. Eliza felt their weight. Colton ate fastest and spoke last. He pushed back from the table, crossed his arms, and looked at Eliza with the direct gaze of a man who does not believe in softening things. "I will say what my brothers will not," he said. "We need someone who can work, not a decoration. If you cannot ride, cannot haul, cannot survive a Montana winter, you should leave now, before anyone gets attached." Eliza set down her spoon. She met his eyes without blinking. "I left everything I had," she said. "I traveled 16 days alone across this country. I did not come here to be a decoration. I came here to build something. If you want to test me, but do not insult me before I have had a chance to prove myself." The silence that followed was long and heavy. Colton studied her the way a man studies a knot he cannot untie. Then he gave a small nod. Not acceptance, just acknowledgement. A door cracked open 1/2 inch. "Fair enough," he said. "We will see." Ida, standing by the stove, turned away to hide her smile. That night, as Eliza lay in Martha Calloway's bed and listened to the sounds of Montana settle around her, she heard a voice from outside. From the barn, not one of the brothers. She went to the window. In the lamplight spilling from the barn door, she could see a 4th man, lean and weathered with a deep scar across his forehead and the careful movements of someone who had learned a long time ago that the world was not safe. He was brushing down a horse and talking to Silas in a voice too low to hear. But she could see Silas's face, and the way the other man gestured toward the house, toward her window. The man looked up. For a moment his eyes caught the lamplight and met hers across the dark yard. She stepped back from the glass. She did not know his name yet. She did not know that Boone Tanner had worked this ranch for 8 years, that he was a veteran of Shiloh, where a piece of artillery shell had carved the scar across his forehead and taken most of his faith in human nature with it. That he had watched 2 women come to this ranch before Eliza and watched both of them leave, and that he had decided long ago that no Eastern woman belonged in Montana. She did not know any of that. She only knew the look in his eyes when he saw her in the window. It was not hostility. It was certainty. The certainty of a man who already knew how this story ended and was simply waiting for it to play out. 3 days passed. Eliza proved herself the only way she knew how, through work. She rose before dawn each morning and learned the stove before anyone told her to. She learned which draft to close at midnight and which to crack open at sunrise. She learned the sound the chimney made when the wind shifted north and how to adjust the flue before smoke filled the room. She cataloged the pantry planned meals for 3 men who ate like 6 mended a curtain with thread from her own hem and scrubbed the kitchen floor until the wood showed grain that had been hidden under years of boot dirt. Ida Brennan watched all of this with the sharp eyes of a woman who has seen too many good intentions collapse under the weight of reality. On the third morning, she said to Opal Hensley over the counter at the store, "That girl learns faster than any woman I have known, and she does not complain. Not once, Birom." On the third day, Eliza did something that changed the way the Calloway brothers looked at her. She found a pair of canvas riding trousers in the trunk at the foot of Martha's bed. They were old and they were too large, but she belted them tight and tucked the cuffs into borrowed boots and walked to the barn with her chin up and her jaw set. Silas was saddling his horse when he saw her. He stopped with one hand on the cinch strap and looked at her the way a man looks at something he did not expect and is not yet sure what to do with. "I would like to ride out with you today," Eliza said. "I want to see the ranch." "You can ride," Silas said. It was half question, half statement. "My father kept horses before he lost everything. I have been riding since I was 7. Silas studied her for a long moment. Then he pointed to a small mare with gentle eyes standing in the third stall. "Her name is Rosie," he said. "She is patient." Liza saddled Rosie herself. Her hands remembered the motions even though her muscles had forgotten the weight. She mounted with the ease of someone who had learned young and never entirely forgotten. And when she rode out of the barn and fell into step beside Silas, she saw something change in his face. Not surprise. Something before surprise. The foundation on which surprise might later be built. They rode all morning. Levi joined them in the north pasture and explained the water system. 2 creeks and a small lake fed by mountain runoff. These were the most valuable assets on the ranch. More valuable than the cattle, more valuable than the timber. Water in Montana Territory was the difference between an empire and a graveyard. "That water," Levi said, pointing toward the creek that cut through the valley below them, "is the reason Cornelius Drake has been trying to buy this land for 5 years. "Who is Cornelius Drake?" Eliza asked. Silas answered. His voice was flat. "Owns the biggest ranch in the territory, 50,000 acres. But his land is dry. He needs our water. Our father refused to sell." Then things started happening. Fences cut, cattle scattered, pastures burned. They rode along the northern fence line. Eliza saw it before either brother pointed it out. Barbed wire cut clean through in 3 places. Not weathered, not broken by wind or animal. Cut by pliers, deliberately, recently. Colton, who had ridden up from the east pasture, looked at the cut wire and his face went dark as a storm front. "Drake," he said, again. Silas said nothing for a long moment. Then he spoke, and his voice had the quality of a man reciting a fact he has carried for a long time and has never stopped weighing. "Our father was the best horseman in this territory. 2 years ago, they said he died from a fall." He paused. He did not fall. The words landed in Eliza's chest and stayed there. That evening, while the brothers were in the barn and the house was quiet, Ida Brennan caught Eliza by the arm in the kitchen. The older woman's fingers were strong and her eyes were urgent. "Listen to me," Ida said. Her voice was low and fast, the voice of a woman who has been holding something for too long and cannot hold it any longer. "Cornelius Drake did not just want this land. He and Ezra Calloway were partners 30 years ago. They built this ranch together. Then Ezra bought Drake out. Fair and square. Witnesses, bill of sale. Drake never forgave him." Ida glanced toward the door. Her grip tightened on Eliza's arm. 2 months before Ezra died, he told me something. He said he had proof that Drake had been stealing water from the Calloway Creek for years, diverting it through illegal channels to his own land. Ezra said he hid the proof somewhere in this house, somewhere only family would find it. Ida's eyes moved toward the ceiling, toward the room upstairs, toward the bed where Eliza slept. "In that room," Ida said. "Somewhere in that room. Ezra hid it where Martha would have kept her most precious things. But I do not have the key, and I did not tell the boys because if they find that proof and confront Drake before they are ready, Drake will do to them what he did to their father. Eliza stood in the kitchen with the lamplight playing across her face and the sound of the brothers' voices drifting from the barn and a new weight settling on her shoulders that she had not asked to carry but could not put down. The box beneath the bed, locked, no key. She thought about it all through supper. Through the evening, while Levi read aloud from a volume of Tennyson and Silas whittled by the fire and Colton cleaned his boots on the porch. She thought about it while she helped Ida wash the dishes and while she checked the stove before bed and while she climbed the stairs to Martha's room and lay down in the dark. She thought about a dead man hiding evidence in his dead wife's room, about a locked box and a missing key and a woman named Martha Calloway who loved Wuthering Heights and died of fever when her boys were still children. She was still thinking when she heard it. A sound outside the window. Soft, careful. The sound of a horse being ridden slowly, deliberately by someone who did not want to be heard. Eliza rose from the bed, moved to the window, pressed herself against the wall, and looked out through the edge of the glass. A rider. One rider. Moving past the cabin in the dark. The horse was walking, not trotting, and the rider sat hunched in the saddle with a hat pulled low. Not one of the brothers. She knew their horses by now. She knew the sound each one made. This was a different horse, a different rider. A light swept across her window. A lantern held low-angled to look inside. Eliza froze. The light passed over the glass and moved on. The hoofbeats faded. She stood by the window for a long time after the sound was gone. Her heart was beating too fast. Her hands were cold. In the morning she found it, a piece of paper on the windowsill weighed down by a small stone. She picked it up, unfolded it. The handwriting was neat, unhurried. The hand of someone who had all the time in the world. Miss Weston, or should I say Miss Harwell, your stepfather sends his regards. He is coming for you. Eliza read the note 3 times. Her hands did not shake. She was past shaking. She was in the place beyond shaking where everything goes still and clear, and the mind begins to work with the cold precision of a clock that knows exactly how many minutes are left before the alarm. The note used the name Harwell. Edgar's name. That meant Edgar knew where she was. That meant someone in Copper Creek was working for Edgar. And that meant the man in the gray coat she had noticed on the train 3 seats behind her boarding at the same stations, changing at the same stop in Chicago was not a coincidence. She folded the note, put it in the pocket of her dress. She would need it later. She did not know yet how much. Then she went downstairs, set the coffee to boil, and began to make breakfast for 3 men who did not yet know that the woman they had sent for was carrying a war behind her eyes. Silas came in first. He saw her face. What happened, he asked. Eliza set the note on the table. She looked at him, at Levi coming through the door, at Colton stamping mud from his boots on the porch. She told them everything. She told them about Edgar Harwell, about her mother's remarriage, about the hands that found excuses to touch, about the door tried once, twice, 3 times in the dark, about the night he came drunk and pushed it open and she screamed and her mother turned away, about the $200 she took money Edgar had given her mother to buy silence for what he had done, about the train, about the man in the gray coat, about the note on her windowsill. She told them all of it, and then she stood in the kitchen with her hands at her sides and waited to be judged. Silas read the note. His face did not change, but something behind his eyes moved, something heavy and cold, the way tectonic plates move deep beneath the ground before the earth splits open. Levi's hands closed into fists on the table. The knuckles went white. Colton stood up, walked to the porch, hit the post with his fist hard enough to shake dust from the rafters. Then he came back in. His face was red, but his voice was controlled. If that man comes to this ranch, he said, I will make sure he leaves on a stretcher. Silas spoke last. His voice was flat and steady and carried more weight than a shout. You are on our land. That makes your safety our responsibility. He will not touch you here. Then he looked at her, not the evaluating look she had grown used to, not the measuring look of a man calculating what a woman is worth. He looked at her the way a person looks at another person when they are seeing them clearly for the first time. You should have told us sooner, he said, but I understand why you did not. From the doorway came a voice that was not one of the brothers. So she is not just a mail-order bride. She is a thief running from the law. And she brought her trouble all the way from Philadelphia to our doorstep. Boone Tanner stood in the frame, his scarred forehead catching the morning light, his eyes narrow with the particular certainty of a man who has been proven right about something he wished he had been wrong about. He looked at Silas. "I told you. More mouths, more trouble." Silas turned toward him. The look he gave Boone Tanner could have frozen a river in August. "Enough," Silas said. Boone held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then he turned and walked back to the barn. But the judgment he left behind settled over Eliza like frost on a window pane. Cold, visible, hard to remove. She had felt it before. In Philadelphia after her father died. In every town she passed through on the way west. The look that asked, what kind of woman ends up like this? She stood in the kitchen of a ranch house in Montana Territory with 3 men around her who had promised to protect her, and 1 man outside who had already decided she was not worth protecting, and she understood with perfect clarity that the next days would determine whether she stayed or whether she became the third woman to vanish from this ranch in the middle of the night. She also understood that she was not going anywhere. Eliza Weston had walked 1,000 miles. She had left everything behind. She had sat alone on a train platform in a territory she had never seen and refused to be afraid. She would not start being afraid now. Outside the window, the Montana morning was bright and wide and indifferent to the small dramas of human beings. The mountains stood where they had always stood. The wind moved through the grass the way it had moved for 1,000 years before anyone built a fence or filed a claim or wrote a letter to a stranger begging for a life worth living. Somewhere out there, a man named Edgar Harwell was coming. Somewhere out there, a man named Cornelius Drake was circling. Somewhere out there, a woman named Vivian Pruitt was already telling the town that Eliza Weston was not what she seemed. And beneath a dead woman's bed in a locked wooden box was the truth that could save everything or destroy it. Eliza poured the coffee, set 4 cups on the table, and began her second week in a place that was not yet home, but was for the first time in her life worth fighting for. Winter came to the Montana Territory the way trouble comes to good people. Slowly at first, then all at once. The frost painted the cabin windows white by the second week of September. By the third, the creek ran sluggish and cold, and ice formed along its edges in thin sheets that cracked under the weight of a drinking cup. Silas stacked firewood higher each day, cutting and hauling from the stand of pine on the north slope, building a wall of split logs along the side of the cabin that grew taller than Eliza's head. He moved with the steady urgency of a man who has survived enough winters to know what is coming and refuses to be caught short again. Eliza learned the rhythms. She learned which draft to seal and which to leave cracked. She learned the sound the chimney made when the wind turned north, a low moan like a sick animal, and how to adjust the fuel before the smoke backed up and filled the room. She learned to keep the stove burning through the long, dark hours without choking it or letting it go cold. She learned that coffee had to be on before the brothers came in from the barn at dawn, that bread had to rise overnight, that a pot of beans could stretch 3 days if you knew what to add and when. But there was a cold inside Eliza that had nothing to do with weather. The note on her windowsill played in her head on a loop she could not silence. "Your stepfather sends his regards. He is coming for you." She carried that note in her pocket like a stone. She felt its weight with every step. Boone Tanner made his feelings known without saying another word about it. He did not need to. The way he looked at Eliza when she crossed the yard said everything. The way he set his jaw when she brought coffee to the barn. The way he spoke to Silas with his back turned to her as if she were a piece of furniture that someone had placed in the room without his permission. 2 weeks after Eliza arrived, Silas drove her into town for supplies. The morning was clear and sharp, the kind of autumn day that tricks you into thinking the world is on your side. Eliza sat beside him on the wagon bench and watched the land change around them. Open pasture giving way to the shallow valley where Copper Creek huddled between 2 roads. They stopped in front of Hensley Dry Goods. Silas helped her down and said he would be at the feedlot. Then he paused. His hand stayed on her elbow a moment longer than it needed to. "Do not wander toward the saloon," he said. She did not intend to. Inside the store, Opal Hensley was already pulling items from shelves before Eliza reached the counter. Flour, salt, a small cone of sugar wrapped in brown paper, thread, a tin of lard. "How are the boys treating you?" Opal asked without looking up. "Well," Eliza said, "better than I expected." Opal set the goods on the counter. Her hands paused. She looked at Eliza with those sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Good," she said, "because you need to know something. A man arrived in town 3 days ago, tall, dark suit, watch chain, looks like he stepped out of a Philadelphia courtroom. Eliza felt the blood leave her face. He has been meeting with Cornelius Drake. Opal continued, her voice was low and fast. In the saloon, twice this week, and he has been asking everyone in town about you, your name, where you live, how long you have been here. She paused. They are working together, Eliza. I do not know the details, but I know what it smells like when two foxes circle the same henhouse. Eliza gripped the edge of the counter. Edgar, already here, already building alliances. There is something else, Opal said. She leaned closer. Ask the Calloway boys about their father's will, the real one. There was a clause in it that Drake does not want anyone to know about. Before Eliza could ask more, the bell above the door chimed. Opal straightened and turned away with the smooth ease of a woman who has spent decades pretending she was not just whispering secrets. Eliza gathered her supplies and stepped outside. The sun was bright, the street was quiet, and then she saw her, a child, sitting on the wooden step outside the store, knees drawn to her chest, wearing a dress that had been washed so many times the color had bled away to nothing. A girl of about 7 years old, thin, dirty, brown hair tangled past her shoulders, and eyes, large dark eyes that looked at the world without blinking, without flinching, without any of the softness that should live in a child's face. The eyes of someone who had run out of the capacity for fear because there was nothing left that fear could take from her. Eliza stopped. She set the supplies down on the step. She knelt in front of the girl. Up close, she could see the hollows beneath the child's cheekbones, the dirt beneath her fingernails, the bruise fading to yellow on her left wrist. What is your name? Eliza asked softly. The girl studied her, measuring, deciding. Then she spoke and her voice was small but steady. Wren. Wren what Dawson? Wren Dawson. Opal had come to the door. She stood behind Eliza and spoke in the low, careful voice of a woman delivering news she has been carrying too long. The Dawson family had a ranch north of here, Opal said. Drake wanted their land. They refused to sell. Then their barn burned. Their cattle got sick. Poisoned water. Then the father had an accident with a runaway wagon. Broke his wife's arm, too. They sold at half price and left Montana. Opal paused. The silence was heavy. They left Wren behind, she said. Said they would come back for her. That was 8 months ago. No one came back. I have been feeding her, letting her sleep in the back room. But I am old and I am alone and I cannot raise a child. Eliza looked at Wren. The girl looked back without hope or expectation or any of the things a 7-year-old should feel when an adult pays attention to her. She looked at Eliza the way a stray dog looks at an outstretched hand, wanting to trust but knowing from experience that trust is the thing that gets you hurt. Something broke inside Eliza's chest, something that had been held together by wire and willpower since the night she fled Philadelphia in the dark. It broke, and what came through the crack was not weakness, but something stronger, something that had been waiting for a reason. Would you like to come with me, Wren? Eliza said. Where I live there is a warm house, a stove, people who will take care of you. Wren did not smile, did not cry, did not do any of the things you might expect a child to do when offered rescue. She simply extended her hand, small, dirty, steady as iron. Eliza took it. When Silas returned with the wagon, he found Eliza standing outside the store with a bag of supplies in one arm and a silent child holding her other hand. He looked at Eliza. He looked at Wren. He looked at the way the girl's small fingers gripped Eliza's with the desperate strength of someone holding on to the only solid thing in a world that had taken everything else. His face did not change, but something behind his eyes did. A softening, a recognition, the look of a man watching someone do a thing he thought the world had forgotten how to do. He climbed down from the wagon, knelt in front of Wren. The girl shrank back against Eliza's leg. You hungry? Silas asked. His voice was rough but not unkind. The same voice he used for spooked horses. Wren nodded. There is jerky in the saddlebag, he said, in a blanket behind the seat. Help yourself. He did not ask questions, did not demand explanations. He lifted Wren into the wagon with the same careful strength he used for everything, set her on the blanket, and handed her a strip of dried beef. Then he turned to Eliza. She expected resistance, expected the same words Boone would have used. another mouth to feed. Instead, Silas looked at her for a long moment. Then he gave a single nod, the kind that carried everything words could not. They rode home with Wren curled in the back of the wagon, eating jerky with both hands, watching the mountains with the bottomless fascination of a child who has stopped expecting anything and therefore finds wonder in everything. Colton was the first to react when they arrived. He stood in the barn doorway and looked at Wren and then at Eliza with an expression that was difficult to read. Then he walked to the wagon, pulled a horse blanket from the rail, and draped it over Wren's shoulders without a word. Levi brought soup. Ida brought clean clothes from a trunk in the attic. And Wren, sitting at the kitchen table with her feet dangling above the floor, ate 3 bowls of soup and did not speak until the last spoonful was gone. Then she looked at Eliza and said very quietly, "Can I sleep inside?" The question hit the room like a hammer striking glass. 5 adults stood in a kitchen, and every one of them understood what that question meant. A 7-year-old girl asking if she was allowed to sleep inside. Inside. As if sleeping outside were the normal condition of her life. Eliza knelt beside her, pushed the tangled hair back from her face, looked her in the eyes. "You will sleep in my room," Eliza said, "in a real bed, every night." Wren did not smile, but she leaned her head against Eliza's shoulder and closed her eyes, and the weight of that small body against hers was the heaviest and lightest thing Eliza had ever carried. The gossip hit Copper Creek like wildfire. Vivian Pruitt was the engine, and her church auxiliary women were the wheels. And together they spread a version of Eliza's story through the town that bore almost no resemblance to the truth, but fit perfectly into the shape of their disapproval. Eliza Weston was living with 3 unmarried men, no chaperone, no marriage certificate, no ring on her finger. She had taken in a stray child with no legal authority to do so. She came from a family of debtors. She herself had stolen money from her own household in Philadelphia. She was in Vivian's telling, a woman of loose morals and questionable judgment who had attached herself to the Calloway fortune like a tick on a hound. The Sunday service was where it came to a head. Eliza went to church with the 3 brothers and Wren because that is what you do when a community is watching and you need them to see you as a person rather than a rumor. She wore her best dress. She braided Wren's hair and pinned it with a ribbon Ida had given her. She walked through the church doors with her chin up and her back straight. Vivian Pruitt stood at the entrance like a sentry. She smiled at the brothers. She smiled at the ranchers filing past. She did not smile at Eliza. "How strange," Vivian said, and her voice carried across the churchyard with the precision of a woman who has spent decades learning how to say cruel things at exactly the right volume, that a woman living with 3 men would walk into the house of God as though there were nothing wrong with the arrangement. Several heads turned. Whispers moved through the crowd like wind through dry grass. Eliza stopped. She turned. She looked at Vivian Pruitt and felt the same cold clarity she had felt when she read the note on her windowsill. "Mrs. Pruitt," she said, "I came to church to pray, not to be judged. If you have a problem with how I live, I believe you may leave that as a conversation between you and God, not between you and me." The churchyard went silent. Someone in the back coughed. 2 of Vivian's churchwomen exchanged glances. Vivian's smile tightened into something that was no longer a smile but a line drawn in the sand. After the service, Silas made his choice public. He stood in front of the church with Eliza beside him and Wren holding Eliza's hand, and he spoke to the faces watching them with the flat, unwavering voice of a man who does not care whether he is liked but insists on being respected. "Miss Weston is a guest on my land," he said. "Anyone who has a problem with that can say it to me." No one did, not to his face. But the damage Vivian had done was already spreading through the town like roots through soil, invisible and deep. The first real test came on a night in late September when the wind screamed through the valley and tore a section of the east fence clean away. Silas and Boone had ridden out before dawn to check the herd at the far pasture. A section of fence had come down in the previous storm, and a dozen head had scattered into the timber. They would not be back until after dark. Levi stayed behind because his horse had pulled up lame the day before. Colton was checking the south line. Eliza was feeding the stove when she heard it. The cattle lowing restless and afraid. Then the creak of the broken fence. Then hooves on soft ground. The cows were getting out. She looked at Wren. The girl was sitting at the table drawing on a scrap of paper with a piece of charcoal. "Stay here," Eliza said. "Do not leave this house." Then she pulled on Silas's spare coat, grabbed the hammer and the coil of wire from the lean-to, and walked out into the dark. It took her 2 hours. Her hands bled from the wire. The wind knocked her flat twice. She worked by lantern light, driving stakes and twisting wire with fingers that had gone numb before she finished the first post. Halfway through, a second light appeared behind her. She turned. Wren. Standing in the wind with a lantern held in both hands, her small body braced against gusts that could have blown her sideways. She did not speak. She did not ask permission. She just held the light steady while Eliza worked. 7 years old, and she held that lantern like a surgeon's assistant, unflinching. By dawn, the fence held. Not perfect, but enough. When Silas and Boone rode in at first light, both of them mud-splattered and grim from a night chasing strays, they found Eliza sitting on the porch step with raw hands and a face pale with exhaustion. They looked at the fence, they looked at her hands, they looked at her face. Silas did not say thank you, did not say well done. He gave her one nod, slow, deep, a nod that carried more weight than any word she had heard in years. Boone stood behind Silas. He stared at the fence, then at Eliza's bleeding hands, then at the fence again. The scar on his forehead creased as something in his expression shifted. Not warmth, not yet, but the skepticism had cracked. "You know wire work?" he asked. "I grew up on a farm," she said. He said nothing more, but that evening he ate 2 bowls of the stew she made and did not complain about a single thing. And when Wren sat beside him by the fire, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of pine and began to whittle. His hands moved with the quiet precision of a man who has done this 1,000 times, and when he held up the finished piece, it was a horse. Rough, simple, perfect. He set it on the table in front of Wren without a word. The girl picked it up and studied it with grave attention. Then she looked at Boone and said thank you in a voice so small it barely carried across the table. And Boone Tanner looked away because there was something in his eyes that he was not ready for anyone to see. No one commented, but everyone noticed. 3 weeks after Eliza arrived, Edgar Harwell came to Copper Creek. He arrived in a hired buggy with Sheriff Harlan Whelan riding alongside. Edgar was exactly as Eliza had feared. Tall, thin, dressed in a dark suit with a watch chain across his vest, the kind of clothes that cost more than most men in Montana earned in a month. His face was narrow and clean-shaved and careful, the face of a man who measured everything before he touched it. He stepped down from the buggy in front of the Callaway ranch house and looked at the cabin the way a man looks at something he intends to condemn. His eyes moved from the sagging porch step to the patched roof to the single window where Wren's face was pressed against the glass. Then they moved to Eliza standing in the doorway with her arms at her sides. "Eliza," he said. His voice was pleasant, conversational, the voice of a man who has practiced being reasonable while meaning nothing of the kind. "Your mother is worried sick. I have traveled 1,000 miles to bring you home." Eliza felt the ground shift beneath her feet, not from fear, from recognition. She had heard that voice before, in the hallway outside her bedroom. Through the door he tried to open, the voice of a man who wraps his teeth in silk. "I am not going anywhere," she said. Edgar reached into his coat and produced a document. Folded, official. "I am your legal guardian until your 25th birthday," he said. 8 more months. And you took $200 from our household account before you fled. "That is theft, Eliza. I can have you arrested." The barn door opened. Silas stepped out. Levi came from the house. Colton from the corral. 3 men who moved without hurry but with absolute purpose. And when they stopped, they stood between Edgar and Eliza like a wall built from bone and resolution. "She is on our land," Silas said. His voice was flat as a blade laid on stone. "And she is going to be my wife. That makes her safety our concern." Edgar looked at the 3 brothers. His pleasant smile remained, but something cold moved behind it like a fish beneath ice. "Married," he said. "I do not see a ring, Mr. Calloway. And even if you marry her tomorrow, guardianship law does not dissolve because of a frontier wedding. I will return with a court order and a judge." He gathered his reins, turned his buggy. The sheriff followed his hand, still resting on his holstered pistol, with the casual menace of a man who has been told where to put his hands and when. But before Edgar rode out of earshot, he turned in his seat and called back. His voice carried clear in the cold morning air. Ask your bride what really happened in Philadelphia, gentlemen. Ask her why she left in the middle of the night. And ask about the money. Then he was gone. Dust settling, hooves fading, and Eliza standing in the yard with three men and a truth she had already told them and a truth she had not. The $200, she said. Her voice was steady. She owed them this. Silas waited. It was not from a household account, Eliza said. Edgar gave that money to my mother, hush money, payment for what he had done to me, for the nights he tried my door, for the silence my mother bought with her eyes closed. I took it because I believed it was owed to me, not as theft, as the price of my silence. She looked at Silas. But I have no proof. In the eyes of the law, I stole it. The wind moved through the yard. Wren stood in the cabin doorway, watching with eyes that had seen too much for 7 years. Silas said nothing for a long time. Then he spoke, and his voice was quiet in the way that deep water is quiet. A man who pays his stepdaughter money in the middle of the night has a story he does not want told. That story is your proof. He will not want it heard in open court. Eliza looked at him. For the first time since she arrived in Montana, she felt something she had almost forgotten the shape of. Not safety, deeper than safety. The feeling of being understood by someone who does not require you to be perfect in order to stand beside you. That evening, after the children were asleep, Eliza sat in the kitchen by lamplight and thought about the locked box beneath her bed. Ida had said Ezra hid the proof where Martha would have kept her most precious things. The room upstairs was Martha's room. The box was beneath Martha's bed. The key was hidden somewhere only Martha or someone who knew Martha deeply would think to look. Martha loved Wuthering Heights. Eliza climbed the stairs, entered the room. Wren was sleeping in the bed, one arm flung across the pillow, breathing softly. Eliza moved to the bookshelf above the dresser. She ran her fingers along the spines until she found it. A worn copy of Wuthering Heights. She had noticed it her first night, but had not touched it. Now she pulled it from the shelf. She opened it to page 78. The page where Catherine speaks the line that Martha Calloway had loved enough to read to her sons a dozen times. I am Heathcliff. And there pressed into the spine between pages 78 and 79 was a small brass key. Eliza knelt beside the bed, reached beneath the frame, pulled out the wooden box, fitted the key to the lock, turned it. Inside, she found 4 things. The first was an original deed of sale dated 1848, signed by both Ezra Calloway and Cornelius Drake. 3 witnesses, a price that matched the market value of the land at that time. Clean, legal, no duress. This was the document that proved Ezra bought the land fair and square, despite whatever story Drake was now telling. The second was a hand-drawn map, detailed and precise, showing a system of irrigation channels that ran from the Calloway Creek across the property line to Drake's land. Channels dug in secret, channels that diverted water illegally under territorial law, channels that Ezra had discovered and documented before he died. The third was a will, Ezra Calloway's last will and testament, not the version Drake had followed with the county, the real one. And in it, a clause that made Eliza's breath stop. Should my sons marry and establish a family on this land, the homestead claim becomes irrevocable under territorial law. No individual or entity may challenge an ownership once the family clause is fulfilled. Eliza read the clause twice. This was what Drake feared. This was why he was trying to take the land before a wedding could happen. This was why the 2 brides before Eliza had been driven away, not by the harshness of Montana, by something else, someone else. The 4th item was a letter, written on paper that had gone soft from handling. The handwriting was light and feminine and careful. My sons, find someone who will fight for this land as hard as you do. Someone who stays not because she must, but because she chooses to. I asked your father to find her for you. He promised he would. I trust him to keep that promise even after I am gone. Your loving mother, Martha. Eliza held the letter in her lap. The lantern light caught the faded ink. She could see it clearly now. A dying woman asking her husband to find a wife for her sons. A man hiding a key inside his dead wife's favorite book on the page with the words she loved most. A promise kept across years and death in the kind of distance that love tries to cross and sometimes manages to bridge. She cried, not for herself, for Martha Calloway, who had believed in the existence of a woman she would never meet, For Ezra, who had hidden the truth where he trusted it would be found. For the three sons upstairs who had grown up without a mother and never knew she had written them a letter that ended with the word love. A sound beside her, small, quiet. Wren had woken. The girl sat up in bed and looked at Eliza on the floor with the tin box in her lap and tears on her face. She did not ask what was wrong. She climbed down from the bed and sat beside Eliza and leaned her head against her shoulder and said nothing for a long time. Then she spoke. Her voice was quiet but steady, the voice of a child who had carried too much and learned too early that caring is what you do when there is no one else. You brought me here, Wren said. You will keep us here. Eliza looked at her. 7 years old, bones too sharp, eyes too old, brave in the way that only people who have been afraid for a very long time can be. Yes, Eliza said, I will. In the morning, she brought the box to the kitchen table. She set it before the three brothers and opened the lid. Silas read the will. His hands trembled when they touched his father's handwriting. He did not speak for a long time. Levi read Martha's letter. He had to turn away. His shoulders shook once, twice. Then he was still. Colton looked at the map of the illegal water channels, and his face went dark, and his fist hit the table hard enough to rattle the coffee cups. I knew it, he said. I knew that snake was stealing our water. Eliza laid out the logic. Your father's will says if you marry and establish a family, the land cannot be challenged. Drake knows this. That is why he tried to take the land before a wedding can happen. That is why the two brides before me were driven away. The room was quiet. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind moved through the valley with the indifference of a force that has no stake in human affairs. Silas stood. He walked around the table. He stopped in front of Eliza. I was going to ask you to marry me because it was practical, he said, because it would protect the land, because my mother asked for it in her will. He paused. His throat moved. But that is not why I am asking now. I am asking because every morning when you come down those stairs, I forget what silence sounds like. Because when you laugh, I hold still so I can hear all of it before the world moves again. Because you fixed the fence in a storm with your hands bleeding and did not ask for thanks. Because you found my mother's letter and cried for a woman you never met. Because you brought home a child no one wanted and gave her a bed and a name and a reason to sleep inside. He held out his hand. Rough, cracked, scarred from years of work that never ended and never would. I do not have a ring, he said. I have this land in these hands and whatever time God gives me. Will you marry me, Eliza? Not for the land, not for the law, because you want to. She looked at him, at his amber eyes tired but steady, at the scar along his jaw, at the hands that had carried her bag at the train station as if it weighed nothing and had carried her safety ever since as if it weighed everything. Yes, she said, because I want to. Levi smiled, a real smile, the first full one Eliza had seen from him. Colton hit the table again, but this time it was celebration. About time, he said. And Wren, standing in the doorway where she had been listening from the start, ran across the room and wrapped her arms around Eliza's waist and held on as if she were anchoring herself to the earth. But the wedding would have to wait. Edgar Harwell had filed a guardianship petition with the county court. Cornelius Drake had filed a land claim. Both cases were set for the same hearing, 3 weeks away. If Edgar won, Eliza would be dragged back to Philadelphia before a wedding could take place. If Drake won, there would be no land to protect. 2 enemies, 1 hearing, and the judge's wife was already poisoning the well. The days that followed were the most dangerous Eliza had known since arriving in Montana. Drake did not wait. He struck in the dark the way men strike, who have power and no conscience, and the patience to use both. The first blow came at midnight on a Tuesday. Eliza woke to the smell of smoke. She ran to the window and saw the east pasture burning, flames crawling through the dry grass, moving fast, moving hungry, painting the night orange and black. The cattle screamed, the horses stamped and kicked in the barn. She and Silas and Levi and Boone ran into the dark and fought the fire for 5 hours. They dug trenches, beat flames with wet blankets, drove cattle through gaps in the fence towards safe ground. By dawn, the fire was out, but 20 head of cattle lay dead in the charred field, and the east pasture was a black scar on the land. Eliza walked through the ashes as the sun came up. Her dress was ruined. Her hands were black. Her lungs burned from smoke. She moved through the wreckage, looking searching, knowing that fires do not start themselves, and men who set them sometimes leave evidence. She found it near the fence line. A silver button, small, distinctive, the kind of button found on one specific type of vest. She had seen that vest before. On Deputy Buckley, the man who rode beside Sheriff Whelan, the man who stood behind Edgar Harwell with his hand on his holster. She picked up the button, put it in her pocket with the note. Evidence is evidence. The second blow came 2 days later and was worse. Colton was riding back from the south pasture on a trail he had ridden 1,000 times, a trail he could ride blindfolded. He was halfway through a narrow stretch between two rock outcroppings when his horse screamed and went down. Barbed wire, strung across the trail at knee height, deliberate, recent, invisible in the shadows between the rocks. Colton flew from the saddle and hit the ground, and his right leg folded beneath him at an angle that no leg should fold. The sound he made was not a scream. It was something deeper, the sound of bone giving way. Levi found him an hour later, sent word to the ranch, and Eliza did not wait. She grabbed bandages and splints and rode Rosie hard through the fading light until she found Colton lying beside the trail, his face gray with pain, his teeth clenched against sounds he refused to make. She knelt beside him. Her hands were cold, but her mind was clear. She remembered the summer she was 14, the year before her father lost everything when a horse on the farm broke its leg in a ditch, and her father showed her how to set bone with sticks and rope and steady hands. She worked fast, 2 straight branches from the scrub oak nearby, leather straps from the saddle. She aligned the break by feeling her fingers reading the bone beneath the skin, the way a blind person reads letters, and she bound the splint tight while Colton grunted through his teeth. "You know what you are doing," he said, not a question. "I grew up with horses," she said. Broken bones were part of the education. Doc Avery Patterson rode out from town the next morning. He examined Colton's leg and looked at Eliza's splint work, and his eyebrows climbed his forehead. "You may have saved this leg from permanent damage," he said. "Where did you learn frontier medicine, young lady?" "From a man who gambled away everything except his knowledge," Liza said. "My father was not wise with money, but he was wise with horses and with broken things." Doc pulled Eliza aside while the brothers carried Colton inside. His voice dropped, his eyes moved to the door. "There is something you need to know," he said. "Drake has been talking to Judge Pruitt. He wants to file a claim against the Callaway land. Says the original deed was signed under duress, and your stepfather has filed a petition to have you returned to his guardianship. Both cases are set for the same hearing, 3 weeks from now." Doc looked at the strip of barbed wire Levi had brought back from the trail. "This was not an accident," he said. "Someone strung that wire to hurt whoever rode through." Then his voice dropped even further. "And there is one more thing. Ezra Callaway did not die from a fall. I examined the body. The wound on his head was not from hitting the ground. It was from something that hit him from behind. I wrote it in my report, but Drake had the report sealed. He was acting as interim magistrate at the time. I said nothing because I was afraid." Doc's hands were shaking, but his eyes were clear. "I will not be afraid anymore," he said. "I will say all of it in court, under oath, whatever comes of it." Eliza looked at this old man who had been afraid for years and was afraid, still standing in her kitchen, offering the one thing that fear cannot take from a person who has decided to give it away: the truth. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once and looked out the window. The light that came through the glass was the color of late autumn golden and brief, the kind of light that arrives just before the cold closes in. Eliza spent the next days building her case. She sat at the kitchen table after the children were asleep and wrote by lamplight with the stub of a pencil. She organized every piece of evidence: the original deed, the map of illegal water channels, Ezra's true will, Martha's letter, Edgar's threatening note, the silver button from the burned pasture. She numbered the documents, built her argument the way she had built the fence in the storm, one post at a time, with bleeding hands, alone. Then 4 days before the hearing, Silas disappeared. Eliza woke to a cold cabin in an empty bed across the hall. His horse was gone. His coat was gone. On the kitchen table, held down by a stone, was a piece of paper. "There is something I must do before I can stand beside you at that hearing. I will be back. Trust me." Eliza read it twice, 3 times. She held the paper in both hands and felt the tremor that came whenever someone she depended on walked through a door and did not say when they would return. Every man she had ever trusted had left. Her father left in a pile of debts and a stopped heart. Edgar left the pretense of decency on the floor of her bedroom. And now Silas, 4 days before the most important day of her life. Levi found her at the table. He saw her face. He saw the note. He would not leave without a reason, Levi said. Trust him, Colton on crutches, his splinted leg held stiff, thumped into the kitchen. If he said he will be back, he will be back. My brother does not break his word. Wren came downstairs. She looked at Eliza's face and at the empty barn and understood everything without being told. She crossed the room and took Eliza's hand. Did not speak, just held on. That night, Eliza sat at the kitchen table in the dark. Wren sat beside her, drawing on scrap paper, refusing to go to sleep. 7 years old, and she kept company with a woman building a legal case against 2 powerful men by lamplight with a pencil stub and kitchen string, and neither one of them spoke because some things are better said by presence than by words. The second night was worse. No word from Silas. The hearing 2 days away, Colton's leg throbbing, Levi riding double shifts to cover the ranch, Boone standing watch at night because someone had burned their pasture and strung wire across their trail, and there was no reason to believe they would stop. Ida Brennan came late on the second night. She brought something, a yellowed envelope she had found in a pile of Ezra's old correspondence. A letter from the territorial court dated 1876 confirming that Drake had been investigated for illegal water diversion. The case had been dropped when the plaintiff, Ezra Calloway, withdrew his complaint. Someone threatened Ezra into dropping the case, Ida said, and 3 months later, Ezra was dead. Eliza took the envelope, another brick in the wall she was building. She wrote through the night. She did not sleep. She did not eat. She organized and numbered and prepared every question she would ask in front of the judge. She had no lawyer. She had no money. She had no allies inside that courtroom. She had the truth, and she had herself. When dawn came, Eliza Weston was still at the table, the pencil worn to nothing, the papers stacked in order, the case built. She looked out the window at the pale light spreading over the snow that had begun to fall during the night. Somewhere out there, Silas was doing whatever he had gone to do. Somewhere out there, Edgar and Drake were sharpening their knives. Somewhere out there, a judge was preparing to decide whether her life belonged to her or to the men who wanted to own it. She had walked 1,000 miles. She had mended fence in a storm. She had set a broken leg by lantern light. She had found a dead woman's letter in a locked box opened by a key hidden inside a love story. She had done all of it without anyone telling her she could. She stood up, stretched her back, checked on Wren still sleeping at the table with her head on her arms, covered her with a blanket, fed the stove. 2 days until the hearing. Silas gone, enemies circling, a leg broken, a pasture burned, a child depending on her. And the only weapon she had was a stack of papers tied with kitchen string and the kind of stubbornness that does not come from confidence, but from having nothing left to lose. Eliza Weston sat back down at the table, picked up what remained of the pencil, and kept writing. Silas came back on the third morning. Eliza heard the horse before she saw it. She was standing at the stove, heating water for Wren's breakfast, and the sound reached her through the cabin walls like a pulse traveling through rock. She set the pot down, wiped her hands on her apron, walked to the door and opened it. He was coming up the trail on foot, leading the horse. A second figure walked beside him, shorter, thinner, bundled against the cold. Doc Avery Patterson. The old man carried his medical bag in one hand and a leather satchel in the other, and he moved with the stiff determination of a person who has made a decision and intends to see it through regardless of what it costs him. Silas looked like he had not slept in 3 days. His eyes were red-rimmed and his beard had thickened into something beyond stubble. His hands were raw and cracked from cold, the knuckles split in places. Ice had crusted on the brim of his hat and the shoulders of his coat. But his back was straight, his step was sure, and when he saw Eliza standing in the doorway with her arms crossed against the morning chill, something in his face changed. Not a smile, something before a smile. The quiet rearrangement of a man's features when he sees the thing he rode 3 days to come back to. He stopped at the foot of the porch steps. "I am sorry I left without telling you," he said. Eliza came down the steps. She stood in front of him, with her arms still crossed, not in anger, but in the way of a woman holding herself together until she knows whether she can let go. "You are here," she said. "That is enough." He reached into his coat and pulled out two documents. The first was a single sheet of paper bearing Doc Patterson's signature and an official county seal. A medical affidavit. Eliza took it and read. The document stated that Dr. Avery Patterson, practicing physician of Copper Creek, Montana Territory, certified that Ezra Calloway's death on the 12th of March, 1876, was not consistent with a fall from horseback. The cranial injury had been inflicted by a blunt instrument from behind. Doc had filed his original findings with the county, but the report had been sealed by order of Cornelius Drake, who served as interim magistrate at the time. Doc had failed to contest the sealing due to personal cowardice. He now swore this testimony to be true. Eliza looked up from the paper. Doc Patterson stood with his hands deep in his coat pockets, his chin tucked against the wind, his thin frame shaking with cold or something else. He met her eyes. "Should have written that 3 years ago," he said. "Fear makes cowards of us. Drake has had this town under his thumbs so long, most of us forgot we had spines." The second document was a homestead registration. Silas had ridden to the county recorder's office and filed a formal claim for the Calloway Ranch and its 10,000 acres. It was stamped and dated and signed by the territorial clerk. Not full ownership yet, that would take years, but it was legal. It was on record. It gave Eliza and the brothers an address, a home that the territory of Montana recognized as theirs. "You did this for the hearing," Eliza said. Silas looked at her with eyes that were tired but clear. "I did this because it should have been done years ago," he said. "A man ought to put his name on the place he means to stay." Eliza wanted to say something large enough to hold everything she felt, but language is too small for certain things, and this was one of them. So she stepped forward and took his cracked hands and held them between hers, and he understood. They gathered around the kitchen table within the hour, 5 of them now. Eliza and Silas and Doc Patterson and Opal Hensley, who arrived on her mule with a basket of bread and a look on her face that said she had come to fight. And Ida Brennan, who had been in the kitchen since before dawn, making coffee strong enough to dissolve a horseshoe, because Ida believed that no battle should be fought on an empty stomach. Doc laid out what he knew. Drake had hired a claims adjuster from Helena. Not a proper lawyer, but a man who knew contract law well enough to be dangerous. Edgar Harwell would represent himself, which meant he was either confident in his position or too cheap to share the spoils. Judge Amos Pruitt would preside. He was Vivian's husband, which was bad, but he was also a man who had spent 30 years on the bench and took the law seriously, which might be their only advantage. 2 cases would be heard together. Drake's claim that the original 1848 land deed was signed under duress and should be reversed, and Edgar Harwell's petition for guardianship of Eliza, claiming that she was a runaway ward who had stolen $200. Eliza spread her papers on the table. Everything she had organized during the 2 nights Silas was gone. The original deed, the map of illegal water channels, Ezra's true will with the family clause, Martha's letter, the note left on her windowsill, the silver button from the burned pasture, the yellowed court letter showing Drake was investigated for water theft, and Ezra withdrew the complaint 3 months before he died. And now Doc's affidavit. She talked through her case point by point. Her voice was steady, her logic was clear. She laid out each piece of evidence, the way a carpenter lays out boards before building a wall, checking each one for straightness, testing each one for weight. Doc listened. Opal nodded. Ida stood by the stove with her arms crossed and her jaw set. Silas sat still with his hands on his knees, watching Eliza with an expression that had moved past admiration into something like awe. When she finished, the room was quiet for a long moment. Then the front door opened and Boone Tanner stepped in. He had been standing on the porch, listening through the cracked door. How long he had been there, no one knew. He stood in the doorway now, with his hat in his hands and his scarred forehead creased with something that was not skepticism and not quite surrender, but lived somewhere in the difficult territory between the two. "I heard everything," he said. His voice was rough, like words dragged over gravel. "If the court needs someone to say that Eliza Weston is a good woman, I will say it, and I will swear on anything they put in front of me." The room went still. Eliza looked at him. This man who had doubted her from the moment she arrived, who had called her trouble, who had watched her with the certainty of a man waiting for a story to end badly. He was standing in her kitchen with his hat in his hands and his pride on the floor, and the words he said cost him more than anyone in that room would ever know, except Eliza, because she understood what it means to swallow your own certainty and admit you were wrong. "Thank you, Boone," she said. He nodded once, quick and sharp. Then he put his hat back on and walked outside, because Boone Tanner was not a man who stayed in rooms where emotions were running high and there was nothing physical to do about them. The hearing was the next morning, the night before Eliza sat on the porch with Silas. The sky was clear in the west and clouded in the east, and the stars showed through the gap like lanterns in a distant window. The cold was deep and sharp. Their breath made clouds that dissolved into nothing. "Are you ready?" he asked. "No," she said. "But I am going anyway." He almost smiled. "That is the only kind of ready that matters." She leaned into him. His arm came around her shoulders, heavy and warm. They sat together in the cold and did not speak about what tomorrow might bring, because speaking about it would have given shape to fears they could not afford to carry into that courtroom. Wren appeared in the doorway behind them. She was wearing the nightgown Ida had made from a flour sack, and her bare feet were pale against the dark wood of the threshold. She did not speak. She just stood there watching them until Eliza opened her arm and the girl came and pressed herself between them, warm and small and present. Three people on a porch in the dark. Two of them had walked 1,000 miles to get here. One of them had been left behind by everyone she had ever known. All three of them had something to lose tomorrow. Morning came hard and bright, the kind of morning that does not care what you have planned. It offers sunlight and cold in equal measure and leaves you to sort out which one matters more. Eliza dressed in her best clothes, which were also her only good clothes. A dark cotton dress she had pressed with a heated iron the night before. Her hair pinned tight, her boots cleaned of mud. She did not look wealthy or powerful or connected. She looked like exactly what she was. A woman who had walked 1,000 miles and was still standing. Silas appeared from the barn in a clean shirt with his collar scrubbed and his boots shined for the first time since Eliza had known him. He had trimmed his beard and combed his hair, and the effect was startling. Not handsome in the way that word is usually meant, but something better. Solid, present, a man who had put on his best because the occasion demanded it, and who wore it without apology. Levi drove the wagon. Colton sat in the back with his splinted leg propped on a feed sack and his jaw set against the pain of every rut in the road. Wren sat beside Eliza on the bench wearing the cleanest dress they could find for her hair braided by Eliza's careful hands. Her wooden horse, the one Boone had whittled, was clutched in her lap. Boone met them at the edge of the trail. He was riding his own horse, wearing a coat that looked like it had been brushed for the first time in years. His hat was newer than the one he usually wore. His face was freshly shaved pink from the razor, and the scar on his forehead stood out white and deliberate like a mark he had stopped trying to hide. "You do not have to do this," Eliza said. Boone shifted in his saddle. He looked at the horizon for a long time. Then he looked at Eliza. "You do not belong here," he said. "That is what I told Silas the day he brought you home. I said you would not last. I said Montana would break you the way it broke the others." He looked at the road ahead. His jaw worked. "I have been wrong about a lot of things in my life. Horses, weather, the war. But I have never been more wrong about anything than I was about you." He paused. His voice went rough at the edges. "If the court needs someone to say that, I am saying it." They rode to town together. A wagon, 2 horses, 3 men, a woman and a child who had nothing in common except the belief that the truth spoken clearly and without flinching might be enough to defeat the money and the lies and the law arrayed against them. The courthouse stood on the south side of the town square, a plain building of white painted wood with a flat roof and a flagpole where the territorial flag hung limp in the windless morning. It was not much to look at, but it had a certain gravity that came from the things that happened inside it. Lives decided, fate sealed, justice attempted if not always achieved. The courtroom was full. Word had traveled the way it always does in small places, carried on the breath of gossip and the currents of boredom and genuine concern. Ranchers and shopkeepers filled the benches. Vivian Pruitt sat in the front row, her back straight, her cameo at her throat, radiating the confidence of a woman who believed the outcome had already been decided. Her churchwomen flanked her like a personal guard. Cornelius Drake sat at the plaintiff's table on the right. He was a big man, well-fed in a land of lean people with a vest buttoned tight over a broad belly and a face flushed red from whatever he had been drinking at breakfast. Beside him sat a thin man with spectacles and a stack of papers, the claims adjuster from Helena. Edgar Harwell sat at a separate table alone. He wore a dark suit cut too well for Montana territory. His leather briefcase sat open before him with documents arranged in precise rows. He did not look at Eliza when she entered. He did not look at anyone. He looked at his papers with the cold focus of a man who has reduced human beings to entries in a ledger. Eliza walked to the respondent's table on the left. She carried no briefcase. She had a small stack of papers tied with kitchen string and the stub of a pencil in her pocket. Silas sat behind her in the gallery. Doc Patterson sat 3 rows back, clutching his medical bag like a lifeline. Opal Hensley was near the door with Boone beside her, and Wren sat between Opal and Ida, the wooden horse in her bohem, her eyes enormous and unblinking. Judge Amos Pruitt entered through a side door. He was tall and thin in the way that age makes men thin, with white hair and a jaw that looked like it had been set in concrete. He wore no robe, just a dark coat and a white shirt. He sat behind the bench and surveyed the room with eyes that missed nothing and revealed less. He struck the gavel once. The room fell silent. "We are here on 2 matters," he said. "A land claim filed by Mr. Cornelius Drake and a guardianship petition filed by Mr. Edgar Harwell. Both concern the Callaway Ranch and Miss Eliza Weston." He looked at Eliza. "Miss Weston, you have no legal counsel, no, Your Honor. I will speak for myself." A murmur moved through the room. Pruitt silenced it with a look. "Very well, Mr. Drake, present your claim." The claims adjuster stood. He was efficient and dry, and laid out the case with the mechanical precision of a man assembling a clock. The original 1848 deed between Callaway and Drake had been signed under duress. Drake had been coerced into selling below value. He sought return of the land or appropriate compensation. He placed the disputed deed on the judge's bench. Pruitt studied the document. Then he looked at Eliza. "Your response, Miss Weston." Eliza stood. Her hands were trembling. She pressed them flat against the table until they stopped. Then she picked up her papers and stepped forward. "Your Honor, I have the original deed." She placed it on the bench, signed by both parties. 3 witnesses whose names are recorded with the Territorial Land Office. The price paid was market value for 1848. There was no duress. There were no disputes at the time of sale. She placed the map of the water channels beside it. This is a hand-drawn map made by the late Ezra Callaway, showing a system of irrigation channels built by Mr. Drake to divert water illegally from the Callaway Creek to Drake's land. Under territorial water law, this constitutes theft of resources. This diversion has been ongoing for at least 10 years. She placed the will on the bench. And this is Ezra Callaway's true last will and testament. Not the version filed with the county, but the original. It includes a clause stating that once a Callaway son marries and establishes a family on this land, ownership becomes irrevocable under territorial law. Mr. Drake knows about this clause. That is why he is trying to take the land before a wedding can happen. She placed the yellowed court letter beside the rest. And this is correspondence from the territorial court dated 1876, confirming that Mr. Drake was under investigation for illegal water diversion. The case was dropped when Ezra Callaway withdrew his complaint. 3 months later, Ezra Callaway was dead. The room stirred. Drake's face reddened, then went gray. The claims adjuster stared at his papers as if they contained instructions for a situation that had moved far beyond contract law. Doc Avery Patterson was already standing when Eliza turned toward the gallery. The old man rose from his seat with the careful movements of a person whose bones ache and whose courage is burning hot enough to make the bones irrelevant. He walked to the front of the courtroom and stood before the judge and straightened his back and looked Amos Pruitt in the eye. "Your Honor," Doc said, "Ezra Callaway did not die from a fall. I examined the body. The wound on his head was not consistent with impact from the ground. It was inflicted from behind by a blunt instrument. I filed my findings with the county, but the report was sealed by Cornelius Drake, who was serving as interim magistrate at the time. I said nothing because I was afraid of what Drake could do to me, to my practice, to this town." His voice was steady, but his hands were shaking. "I was a coward. I am telling the truth now. Because there is a woman in this courtroom with a child in her lap who deserves better than my silence. The courtroom was absolutely still, not the quiet of an empty room, but the dense, charged quiet of a place where something has shifted and everyone knows it. Opal Hensley stood. Your Honor, 5 years ago, the Dawson family was forced off their land by Mr. Drake through threats and property destruction. Martha Dawson told me directly in my store that Drake threatened to kill her children if they did not sell. She pointed toward the gallery where Wren sat between Ida and the empty space where Opal had been. That child is Wren Dawson. The Dawsons left her behind when they fled. She has been alone for 8 months. She is 7 years old. Wren sat in the gallery with the wooden horse in her lap and looked at Cornelius Drake with eyes that did not blink. 7 years old, and she looked at the man who had destroyed her family with the steady, unforgiving gaze of a person who has nothing left to fear. Ida Brennan stood. 3 weeks ago, someone set fire to the Callaway East pasture. 20 head of cattle died. This was found at the scene. She held up the silver button. This button belongs to Deputy Buckley. He was seen riding back from the North Ridge that same night by 2 ranch hands who will testify. Deputy Buckley, sitting near the back of the courtroom, stood up, then sat back down. His face was white. Drake tried to rise. His mouth opened. The claims adjuster beside him put a hand on his arm, but Drake shook it off. This is slander, Drake said. His voice was loud, but his face was the wrong color. Pruitt struck the gavel. Sit down, Mr. Drake. Drake sat. The room exhaled. Pruitt turned to Edgar Harwell. Mr. Harwell, your petition. Edgar rose. He was smoother than Drake, calmer. He had the trained composure of a man who argued for a living and did not rattle easily. He presented his case with crisp, measured sentences. Eliza Weston was a legal ward who had fled her guardian's home and stolen $200. He was her stepfather by law and her legal guardian until her 25th birthday. He sought her return to Philadelphia and restoration of the funds. He placed his petition on the bench, detailed, professional, the work of a man who understood that law was a weapon and knew how to aim it. Eliza stood again. She reached into her stack of papers and pulled out a single sheet, a piece of paper she had carried in her pocket for 1,000 miles. Your Honor, she said, I would like to address the matter of the $200. She looked at Edgar. He looked back. His face was pleasant. His eyes were not. Mr. Harwell married my mother 2 months after my father died, Eliza said. She spoke slowly and clearly and did not look away from the judge. He paid off my father's debts in exchange for legal guardianship of me until my 25th birthday. She paused, took a breath. The $200 I took was not from a household account. It was money Mr. Harwell gave to my mother to compensate for his behavior toward me. He tried my bedroom door on 3 occasions. On the 3rd occasion, while intoxicated, he forced it open. My mother heard me scream. She did nothing. The courtroom rippled. Edgar's composure flickered. A muscle moved in his jaw. I took that money because I believed it was owed to me. Eliza continued, not as theft, as the price of my silence. If Mr. Harwell wishes to pursue charges, he will need to explain to this court why he was paying his stepdaughter money in the middle of the night. She set the paper down and looked at the judge. I have no legal training, Your Honor. I have no money and no connections in this town. But I know the difference between a guardian and a predator. Mr. Harwell is not here because he cares about me. He is here because he does not want me to be free. The room was still. Even Vivian Pruitt had lost the satisfied expression she had worn like jewelry all morning. She was looking at her husband on the bench with an uncertainty that Eliza had never seen on her face before. Then Boone Tanner stood up. He stood up from the back row of the gallery where he had been sitting with his new hat in his lap and his coat buttoned to the throat and his scarred face freshly shaved. He stood up and he walked to the front of the courtroom with his shoulders squared and his boots heavy on the wooden floor, and he stood before the judge with his hands at his sides and said the words that had been building inside him for weeks. Your Honor, I work for the Callaway Ranch. Have for 8 years now. When Silas first brought Miss Weston home, I thought he was out of his mind. More mouths to feed in a hard winter. I said as much to his face. He paused, looked at Eliza, then back at the judge. I was wrong, he said. I have watched that woman fix fence in a blizzard with her bare hands bleeding. I have seen her set a broken leg by lantern light when neither me nor any of the brothers were there to help. I have eaten her cooking when she had so little that I know she went without so the rest of us could eat. His voice caught. He swallowed hard. She took in a child nobody wanted, a girl left behind by her own family. And in 3 weeks, she turned that girl into someone who laughs and draws pictures and says thank you for a wooden horse carved by a man who did not deserve to be thanked for anything. He stopped. His face was red. His eyes were bright. If this court needs someone to say that Eliza Weston is a fit woman and a good mother and the strongest person I have ever known, I am saying it. And I will swear to it on anything you put in front of me. He sat down, put his hat on, stared straight ahead, did not look at anyone. Silas stood from the gallery. His voice was not loud, but it carried the way deep water carries weight. Your Honor, I intend to marry Miss Weston, not because of the family clause in my father's will, not because of the land, because she walked 1,000 miles to find a life worth living and built one with her own hands. She found evidence my father hid before he was killed. She organized this case alone at my kitchen table while I was gone. She saved my brother's leg. She took in a child. If this court needs to know what kind of person she is, look at the people who came here today to speak for her. Not one of them was asked. They came because of who she is. Colton, still on crutches, thumped the wooden floor with the rubber end. I am saying it too, he said, and I am not known for saying kind things about anyone. Levi stood last. He was the quietest of the three, the one who measured words the way other men measured distance. And when he spoke, the courtroom leaned forward to hear him. She came to us with one bag and one book, Levi said. She left everything behind. She asked for nothing except a chance. That is all any of us has ever wanted. Judge Pruitt sat still for a long time. He looked at the papers spread before him. The deed, the map, the will, the affidavit, the court letter, the silver button. He looked at Drake, whose gray face had not recovered its color. He looked at Edgar, whose composure had developed cracks that no amount of professional polish could hide. He looked at Eliza standing alone at her table with kitchen string around her documents and a pencil stub in her pocket. Then he looked at Wren, sitting in the gallery with a wooden horse in her lap, breathing softly, 7 years old and unaware that her future was being decided by a man with a gavel in a room full of strangers. Pruitt picked up the gavel. I have heard sufficient testimony to render judgment on both matters, he said. On the matter of the land claim filed by Cornelius Drake, the court finds no evidence of duress in the original 1848 deed. The claim is denied. Furthermore, testimony regarding illegal water diversion, property destruction, arson, and the suspicious circumstances surrounding the death of Ezra Calloway warrants immediate investigation by the territorial marshal. Mr. Drake is to be detained pending that investigation. Deputy Buckley is suspended from duty effective immediately. 2 men from the back of the room, ranchers who had been deputized that morning by the judge's order, moved toward Drake. Drake stood. His face was empty, not angry, not defiant, empty the way a building is empty after the fire has gone through. And for one moment his eyes found Eliza's across the courtroom. What she saw there was not hatred but something worse. The flat recognition of a man who has been outplayed by someone he considered beneath him. They let him out. The door closed behind him. The room exhaled. On the matter of the guardianship petition filed by Edgar Harwell, Pruitt continued. The court finds insufficient grounds to sustain the petition. Miss Weston has demonstrated the capacity to manage her own affairs under extraordinary hardship. The circumstances of Mr. Harwell's guardianship, as described in testimony, raise serious concerns that this court cannot ignore. Mr. Harwell, you are advised to leave Montana Territory. Should charges be brought against you in Pennsylvania, this court's records will be made available. Edgar stood. He gathered his papers with the precise movements of a man who packs his bag the same way whether he has won or lost. He closed his briefcase, straightened his coat, walked toward the aisle. As he passed Eliza, she spoke. Her voice was quiet, not angry, not triumphant, just clear. Do not come back. Edgar stopped. For 1 second, something moved behind the professional mask, something that might have been shame or might have been the ghost of a family obligation he had spent years refusing to feel. He did not speak. He walked out of the courtroom and into the cold Montana morning, and Eliza did not know if she would ever see him again. She found that she did not need to know. The courtroom emptied slowly. People filed past Eliza with nods and murmurs. Some of the women who had whispered about her in the street now looked at her with something different in their eyes. Not all of them. Vivian Pruitt swept past without a glance, her back rigid, her jaw set. But others lingered, touched her arm, said small things that meant more than they sounded. Opal reached her first, wrapped her arms around Eliza without saying a word and held on tight. Ida wiped her eyes on her apron and said, "About time this town remembered what justice looks like." Doc Patterson was the last to leave. He stood by the door with his medical bag in hand, looking older than he had that morning, but somehow lighter, as if a weight he had carried for 3 years had finally been set down. Eliza took his hand. "You were brave," she said. He shook his head. "You were brave. I was just late." He squeezed her hand. "Take care of that family. You earned it." The ride home was quiet. Wren sat in the back of the wagon with Colton leaning against his good side, her wooden horse pressed against her chest. Colton looked down at her, and his face, which had been set in a grimace of pain for 3 weeks, softened into something that no one on that ranch had ever seen before. Silas drove. He had not spoken since they left the courthouse. His hands on the reins were steady. His face was calm. But there was something gathering behind his eyes, something that had been waiting for the right moment, the way a river waits behind a dam. Halfway home, where the road passed through a stand of cottonwoods, and the snow had begun to melt into patches of brown earth and new green, he pulled the wagon to a stop. Eliza looked at him. "Why are we stopping?" He set the brake, wrapped the reins around the post, climbed down from the seat, walked around to her side of the wagon, and stood there looking up at her with the trees behind him and the sky windy and pale in the first real warmth of spring, touching the air like a hand reaching through a window. "In that courtroom," he said, "you heard me say I wanted to marry you for the land, for the law, for the family clause. All of that is true." He paused, looked at his hands, then back at her. "But I do not want to marry you for the land, Eliza. I want to marry you because this life, this cabin, these people, the sound of your voice in the morning, and the way you laugh when you think no one is listening, it is everything I told myself I would never have again after we buried our mother and then our father. I told myself this ranch was enough. That work was enough. That silence was enough." His voice did not shake. His eyes did not leave hers. "I was wrong," he said. "You walked through my door with one bag and one book, and you filled every empty room in this house and in me. I am not a man who knows how to say things well. I know how to build fences and shoe horses and pull calves in the dark. But I know this. Whatever I have, it is yours. Whatever comes, I will be standing next to you when it arrives. Not behind you, not in front of you, beside you." Eliza climbed down from the wagon. She stood in front of him on the muddy road between melting snow and bare cottonwoods. "I do not need you to save me," she said. Her voice was steady. Her eyes were clear. "I know," Silas said. "You saved yourself. I watched you do it. I need you to stay. I will not go anywhere. Not ever. Then marry me because you want to. Not because of a courtroom, not because of a contract, because you want to." "I want to," he said. "More than I have wanted anything since the day I forgot how to want." She stepped forward. He stepped forward. And in the middle of a muddy road between melting snow and bare cottonwoods, with 3 people watching from the wagon and the mountains standing witness, and the wind carrying the smell of pine and thawing earth, Eliza Weston kissed Silas Calloway for the first time. It was not the kiss of young lovers. It was not the desperate kiss of people who have run out of options. It was soft and sure and unhurried. The kiss of 2 people who had lost everything and found each other and understood that what they were building was not a fire, but a hearth. The kind of warmth that does not blaze and fade, but holds steady through the long nights and the hard years and the ordinary days that make up a life. In the back of the wagon, Wren smiled, a real smile, the kind she had not worn since before the night her family drove away and left her standing on a porch step with nothing but a name and the clothes on her back. Colton cleared his throat. "You gonna stand there all day?" he called. "Some of us have a broken leg and would like to get home before it freezes again." They held the wedding under the cottonwood tree behind the cabin on a morning in late March, when the first buds were breaking on the branches and the air smelled of wet earth and pine and the distant promise of summer. There was no preacher, no church, no congregation, just 8 people standing in a clearing with the mountains behind them and the sky above them and the dirt beneath their feet. Silas and Eliza, Levi and Colton on his crutches, Opal and Ida and Boone, and Wren. Silas took Eliza's hands, rough on rough, callous on callous. The hands of two people who had spent their lives gripping things that tried to slip away and had finally found something worth holding. "I give you all I have," he said. "These hands, this land, my name, my word. I can carry you when you are tired, and I will never leave." His voice did not shake. His eyes did not leave hers. Eliza spoke. Her voice was clear as creek water. "I have known loss," she said. "I have known the kind of silence that fills your bones and makes you wonder if you will ever hear anything again. But with you, I hear life. I hear Levi reading by the fire. I hear Colton arguing with the horses. I hear your boots on the porch when you come home. I hear Wren laughing in the yard, and that sound alone is worth everything I walked through to get here. I am not afraid of the road ahead. I will walk it with you, and if I have to, I will carry you." Levi stepped forward. In his hands, he held something small and fragile. A flower, purple, barely larger than a thumbnail, dried and pressed flat between two squares of paper. He had found it by the creek 2 weeks earlier, the first wildflower of spring, and he had pressed it in the pages of Wuthering Heights on the shelf above the stove. He laid it between their joined hands. Silas looked at the flower, then at Levi. "Why the book?" Silas asked. "So we remember the first sign of spring," Levi said. "And because Mother would have wanted her favorite book to be part of this." Eliza's heart was so full she could not speak. Together she and Silas knelt and placed the flower in a small hole they had dug at the base of the cottonwood tree. They covered it with dirt and pressed the earth flat with their palms. A flower buried where a family began. They stood. Silas kissed her forehead. She kissed his scarred jaw. And Wren, standing beside Colton, with one hand gripping his crutch and the other holding the wooden horse Boone had whittled for her, asked the question that children ask when the world changes shape around them. "Do I get to stay too?" Eliza knelt. She took the girl's face in both hands, calloused palms against soft cheeks. "You stay," she said. "You are part of this family, from now until forever." Wren did not cry. She had forgotten how. But she leaned forward and pressed her face against Eliza's shoulder and held on with the fierce, trembling grip of a child who has finally been told the thing she was afraid to hope for. Boone Tanner stood at the edge of the clearing with his hat in his hand. He was not a man given to emotion. He was a man given to fence posts and horseshoes and silence. But when Wren looked up from Eliza's shoulder and found his eyes and smiled at him, Boone turned away and faced the mountains and stayed that way until whatever was in his eyes had been put back where he kept it. 5 years passed. The cabin grew. New walls went up, then new rooms, then a proper porch with posts that did not sag, and a railing Silas built from cedar that smelled sweet in the rain. The barn doubled in size. The fence line extended across the north ridge and down to the creek. The herd grew from dozens to 200 head. A chicken coop appeared, then a smokehouse, then a garden where Eliza planted cabbage and carrots and the wildflowers that Levi brought home from the creek bed every spring. Wren was 12 now, tall and serious and capable in the way of people who learned responsibility before they learned to play. She read every book she could find, borrowing from Opal's store and from the traveling library that came through Copper Creek twice a year. She could braid rope and mend tack and calculate the weight of a steer by looking at it, and she was teaching herself to write in a journal she kept beneath her pillow. She called Eliza Mama. She had started doing it one morning 6 months after the wedding, casually, as if she had always said it, and Eliza had turned away and gripped the edge of the stove and breathed until she could see straight. Martha was 3, black-haired and loud and fearless. She had been born in the cabin with Doc Patterson attending and Wren holding the lantern, and she had entered the world screaming as if she already had opinions about it. She was named for the woman whose letter had brought Eliza here, the mother who died before her sons grew up and left behind a key and a love story and a prayer that someone worthy would find it. Henry was one, named for Eliza's father, the man who gambled away everything except his knowledge and his love for horses and his daughter's stubborn spine. Baby Henry had Silas's amber eyes and Eliza's jaw, and he had recently learned to say one word with perfect clarity: Papa. He said it every time Silas walked through the door, and every time Silas stopped what he was doing and picked the boy up and held him against his chest with the same quiet tenderness he had shown the day he took Eliza's bag at the train station, lifting what was heavy to her as if it weighed nothing, carrying what mattered as if it weighed everything. Levi managed the books. His system combined Eliza's education with the brothers' knowledge of cattle and land and the breeding programs and record-keeping methods they developed together made the Callaway Ranch the most efficient operation in the territory. Colton's leg had healed. He still limped when the weather turned damp, and he still cursed about it, and he still argued with horses and with his brothers and with anyone who stood still long enough to argue back. But he had softened in ways only people who knew him could see. He carved wooden animals for Martha and Henry, the way Boone had once carved for Wren, and when he thought no one was watching, he read to the children from the books on the shelf, stumbling over the big words but never stopping. Boone Tanner still came. He brought his wife, now a quiet, kind woman named Emmeline, and their son, a tow-headed boy of 4 who played with Wren and came home covered in mud and happiness. Boone greeted Eliza every morning with a nod that contained the entire history of a man who had been wrong about someone and had spent years being right about her instead. He never spoke about the day in the courtroom when he stood up and said the words that cost him his pride and gave him something better. He did not need to. Everyone remembered. And Boone Tanner was not a man who needed credit for the things he did. He just needed to know they were done. Opal Hensley still tucked extra sugar into Eliza's grocery bag, still squeezed her hand over the counter, still said for the children with a wink that both of them understood. Doc Patterson came quarterly to check on the family. He was slower now, his hands less steady, his steps more careful. But his eyes were sharp and his spine was straight, and he carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who had found his courage late but had not let it go since. Ida Brennan still came twice a week. She was 70 now and moved like it, but she still made coffee strong enough to dissolve a horseshoe, and she still believed no problem was too large if you had a full stomach and a clean conscience. Vivian Pruitt had not spoken to Eliza in 5 years. Eliza did not mind. Some doors were better closed. Drake had been sent to the territorial prison. The investigation uncovered not just the Callaway case, but a pattern of fraud, coercion, arson, and 1 count of murder that sent him away for a very long time. His ranch was broken up and sold to 4 smaller families who turned it into something honest. Sheriff Whelan resigned. A new sheriff was elected, a man with clean hands and no debts. Edgar Harwell never came back. He never wrote. Eliza kept the door open, not because she expected him to walk through it, but because keeping doors open was what Eliza Weston did, even the ones that would never be used. On a warm evening in late spring, Eliza stood at the cabin door and watched her family in the yard. Wren sat on the porch railing reading a book, her long legs dangling in the afternoon sun, catching the auburn tones in her brown hair. Martha chased the dog that Silas had found as a pup, both of them shrieking with the pure, pointless joy that only very small children and very young dogs understand. Henry sat on a blanket in the grass, grabbing fistfuls of clover and laughing at the sky. She reached out and touched the cottonwood tree. It had grown taller and broader in 5 years. Its roots went deep. Its branches spread wide enough to shade the entire porch in summer. Somewhere beneath it, pressed into the earth, was a dried purple flower that a man who loved books had placed between 2 scarred hands on a morning when the world decided to begin again. Silas came up behind her, his arms circled her waist, his chin rested on her shoulder. He smelled of pine sap and leather and the sweet cedar of the porch railing he had just finished sanding. "You remember?" she asked. He did not need to ask what. "The day you stepped off that train with 1 bag," he said. She looked out at the yard, at the children, at the garden coming up green, at the fence line stretching clean and straight across the ridge, at the life they had built from nothing, from a newspaper advertisement and a carpet bag and a brass key hidden in a love story. "There are more of us now," he said. She laughed, a full laugh, open and warm and unafraid. Not the short, startled sound she had made that first winter when something surprised her. This was the laugh of a woman who had walked through fire and come out the other side with her hands full and her heart intact. "But you can still carry them," Silas looked at her. His face had more lines now. His hair had streaks of gray at the temples. His hands were rougher than ever, scarred and calloused and strong. But his eyes were warm. The tiredness that had lived behind them for so long was gone, replaced by something that looked like peace. "Always," he said. The wind moved through the valley. It stirred the grass and rustled the cottonwood leaves and carried with it the smell of earth and wildflowers and the smoke from a chimney that stood straight and true. The sky was wide and the mountains were blue, and the road that Eliza Weston had walked so long ago stretched empty in the distance, carrying no one leading nowhere she needed to go. She was already home. And on the porch, leaning against the railing beside Wren's dangling feet, was a carpet bag. The same carpet bag Eliza had carried off the train at Copper Creek 5 years ago, the one that had held everything she owned in the world. It was stuffed now with Martha's rag dolls and Henry's wooden blocks, and the wildflowers Wren pressed between pages of books so full the clasp could not close. It had carried her here. Now it carried them. Above the clearing, the sky was clean. No clouds, no storms gathering on the horizon, and not a single shadow that did not belong to something that was growing.